Let me just start out by saying I can't believe I get to do this. Well, making these videos this year has brought out my most insecure feelings, and I have definitely felt inadequate. I'm reminded over and over again of a book I was reading in December as I was preparing to do this and getting started with this, that it was talking about when God asks you to do something and you know that He's leading you to do it, and you can't explain it, but you just know that this is mine to do. And I remember when I read that, God just speaking to my heart that it's not about my giftedness or what I have to offer, but that this is something that God has given me to do. And so I receive it as a gift, and I thank you for watching these videos and for joining me. And let's see what we can do this month with the divided kingdom. So the last couple of months we were talking about Saul and David and Solomon during the United Kingdom of Israel. And this was truly, as I'm sure you saw, the glory years of Israel. It was after their wanderings in the desert and their times during the Judges where things were bad more than they were good. But during this time, even though there were some down times, there were some times that one of the kings disobeyed and things weren't great, overall, it was a time that the temple was built, there was great worship of God, there was corporate worship, there's a time of a lot of poetry where they're writing about the greatness of God, and overall they had a lot of power as a nation and a lot of wealth as a nation, a great reputation, and so it was just the glory years. So when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and right away he gets advice from these young men that say you should be really tough on the people and tell them that you're going to double the taxes and they really will respect you more if you're tough on them. Meanwhile, the older men that were the advisors of his father Solomon said, you need to be gentle with the people, tell them that you're on their side. Of course, he takes the advice of the younger men, and because of that, the kingdom is split, and the 10 northern tribes go with another king called Jeroboam. So it's convenient to remember these because their names rhyme. It's Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam is from the line of David, and he, in his kingdom, there's just 2 tribes now, Judah and Benjamin, down in the south, and they are the kingdom from this point forward in the Bible of Judah. So it used to be Israel, now there's 2 nations. The northern nation is Israel, and the southern nation is Judah. So Judah is continuing on the line of Jesus. Their capital is still Jerusalem, where they worship God, and in the northern 10 tribes, their capital is Samaria, not right now, but eventually. And they don't have one dynasty like the line of David that runs through. They all have like a dynasty for 2 or 3 kings, and then all of those people are killed, and a brand new king takes over, and then maybe a couple generations will sit on the throne, and then that whole family will be wiped out, and a new dynasty will take place. That's in the north. So in the north, just lots of total random families that are sitting on the throne. The first one, Jeroboam, though, he is nervous that the people will want to go back to Jerusalem to worship God and for the Passover, and that's where all the religious stuff happens. And he's nervous that if the people from his country go down south and worship God there, that they will have loyalties towards Judah and towards Jerusalem. So he builds places of worship all over Israel, and he sets up priests that were not necessarily Levites, and kind of brings in this worship that's kind of God, but it's using a lot of the pagan practices and stuff. There had been some of that during the Judges, and I'm sure there was some during Saul and David. Solomon brought in a lot of foreign gods, but now especially Jeroboam in the northern 10 tribes in Israel, he purposely is just setting this up not for any religious reason, really for political reasons. And then in the south, Rehoboam and all the kings that follow him, some of them are following God and some of them are following Baal or Asherah. And so there's good kings and bad kings. But in the north, with Israel, they're pretty much all bad kings. It's just one bad king after another. So we won't have time to talk about all of these kings. There were about 20 in the north and 20 in the south. And the only one we're going to talk about in the north, in the kingdom of Israel, is Ahab and his wife Jezebel. So of all of these bad kings, Ahab kind of sticks out, partly because he was like so wicked, and partly because he has a very famous wife. So you've probably heard, even if you didn't grow up in the church, you've heard of the name Jezebel as a negative name for a woman, and this is where it comes from. She was so wicked that a couple stories. One is when her husband wanted this vineyard and the man didn't want to sell it to him because it had been in his family since, Joshua. She just had the guy killed and then gave the vineyard to her husband Ahab. Also, she was very devout to Baal, so much so that not only was she worshiping Baal and financially supporting the priest of Baal, but she was systematically trying to kill and wipe out all of the priests of God throughout the land. And so she was like searching them out, hunting them down, and killing the priest of God to try to completely eradicate the worship of the God of Israel in Israel. So along comes this prophet named Elijah, and he does a few miracles that are pretty cool, but one that sticks out the most is he challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown on Mount Carmel. So they meet at Mount Carmel, and there's 400 prophets of Baal, and they dance around and cut themselves, and they're trying to call down fire from heaven for their sacrifice, and nothing happens. And then Elijah sets up a sacrifice, and they pour water around it, and they put a sacrifice on it, and he prays a simple prayer just saying, hey, God, prove who you are so these people will know you and remember who you are. And fire comes down and completely devours the sacrifice and the water and even the altar. So right after this, he tells Ahab, look, it's been a 3-year drought, but it is about to rain. So go home and get ready for the rain. Well, Ahab leaves, and Elijah, who just had this huge miracle of fire coming down from heaven, he's just prophesied that there's going to be rain, but now he's a little nervous about it. And so he goes and he prays on the other side of this mountain, probably down in kind of, a cave or something. And the Bible says that he put his head down between his knees. And so he was praying just earnestly to the Lord that the Lord would bring rain like he had prophesied. And he tells his servant to go go around the mountain and look in the sky and see if there's anything in the sky. So he goes and looks and he says, clear blue skies, there's nothing. He sends him again to go look, and he says the same thing, clear blue skies, not a cloud in the sky. And the third time Elijah sends this guy to go look at the sky, he comes back to Elijah and he says there is a cloud in the sky about as big as a man's fist. And Elijah is so excited that he tucks his skirt in, his cloak in, and he runs all the way to the city and says, the rain is coming, get ready because your chariot's going to get stuck in the mud. There's going to be so much rain. After that, Elijah gets depressed and says, I'm all alone. There's no one else serving the Lord. And God says, no, there's more. And so it's interesting just to see that he has like these huge spiritual highs and he ends up depressed the next day. I think probably some of you can relate to that. Have you ever been on a retreat and it just feels like, woo, God is speaking to you? And then the next day it's just like, was that real? What just happened? I don't feel him anymore. So we see a lot of stories of that in the Bible, but Elijah is a really kind of pronounced one. So after him, he mostly prophesies to Ahab and Jezebel, which of course they don't listen to him at all, but he performs several miracles. But right after him, Elisha comes along. So first is Elijah, then Elisha. And these are mostly in the books of Kings, right? Elisha, he prophesies to a few kings, to Ahaziah, Joram, Jehu, Jehoahaz, and Joash. So he's prophesying during all of these kings, and he does some cool miracles too, brings a boy back up from life. Both of them, Elijah and Elisha, help widows in different ways. And Elisha also heals a man named Naaman from leprosy. If you read that story, he's the one that's told to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. And one thing significant about the story is Naaman was from Aram, which is kind of modern day Syria. And this was a country that was constantly at war with Israel. And so he was helping basically a leader in the military of the enemies of their country because God had told him to do this. And when Naaman humbled himself and asked the God of Israel for help, the God of Israel helped him. And Naaman went back worshiping God, probably more devoutly than the people in Israel at that time. So those are really significant characters during the kingdom of Israel are Elijah and Elisha. And for about 200 years, all of these dynasties continue, and this kingdom of Israel is happening. During that time, one of the guys that lives there is Jonah, and he's a prophet that God tells him to go preach to Nineveh, right? Well, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, and Assyria is the nation that other prophets were already saying God is going to destroy Israel through Assyria. So when Jonah goes to preach to them, it's not just that they were wicked, they were the enemies of his nation, and they were seeking to destroy his nation. And God was saying, I'm going to destroy them all because they're so wicked. Jonah goes and preaches to them and they repent, and then God doesn't destroy them. And so you can kind of see why Jonah was running from God. He probably felt like he was betraying his nation, and God was reaching out to this other wicked nation. And eventually, about 70 years after Jonah, Assyria did come and destroy Israel and demolish their capital and take their people away as captives. And So that's kind of what Jonah was facing. Amos writes during this time too, and he talks about, the coming judgment of the Lord, and you need to turn back to the Lord, but he also talks a lot about social justice, about the widows, the orphans, the poor, the foreigners, that you needed to treat them right in Israel. And so I hope you notice as you're reading through the Old Testament, there's so many things to notice that it might be easy to miss this unless you're really looking for it. But one of the things to notice is that God is very concerned about issues of social justice, and Amos really highlights this. So there's almost 200 years of history in the northern kingdoms of Israel before Assyria comes and takes them away as captives, and Israel as this northern nation doesn't really exist anymore after that. On the south side, though, on the other side, we have the kingdom of Judah with the capital of Jerusalem and the line of David. And it lasts a lot longer than the kingdom of Israel. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So one of the kings I want to talk about after Rehoboam, about 3 kings after him, is Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat was a very good king. He won some battles and relieved Judah from some oppression of their enemies. And he repaired the temple and he worshiped God. So he was a pretty good king. But one thing he did that lacked wisdom is he aligned himself with the king of Israel, which at that time was Ahab, the wicked Ahab and Jezebel. Jehoshaphat was a God-fearing king, but he made friends with and aligned himself with, he was yoked together with the king, the wicked king of Israel. And as a result of that, his son married Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. So you have a good king, super wicked king, their children get married. During Jehoshaphat's life, this didn't cause that many problems, but we see in the next couple generations, it causes horrible problems. Who he aligned with ended up pretty much wiping out most of his family. So that's Jehoshaphat. His son is Jehoram. Jehoram and Athaliah are married. Athaliah is Jezebel and Ahab's daughter, and Jehoram is Jehoshaphat's son, and they get married. They have Ahaziah, who becomes king after Jehoram dies. And then after Ahaziah dies, Athaliah didn't want their own son or anyone else that's in her family to become king, and the only way that she could be queen and have the throne is if all the male heirs were wiped out. So she killed all of her own sons and her own grandsons and all of the relatives, nephews, cousins, whatever. She kills her own family almost completely so that she can have the throne. So this is the problem, that Jehoshaphat, who was a really good king, because he aligned himself with this wicked king, his grandchildren were all killed by his daughter-in-law. So one of her grandchildren, though, was rescued. He was just a very small child, and he was taken to the temple and secretly raised. And when he was 7, the priest brings him out and says, this is the new king. And if you read the story, you might remember Athaliah comes out and she sees what's happening and she's yelling, treason, treason. And he becomes king and she is killed. And so when he becomes king, Joash, he is a really good king. He once again repairs the temple. So you see like 7 times the temple being repaired, because when there's a bad king, they're really bad. They're like ravishing the temple for any gold or whatever, and it's just falling in disrepair. So here he is again, just like his grandfather, repairing the temple, and they worship the Lord. But when that priest died, Jehoiada died, he became wicked. So he was really good as long as his mentor lived, but as soon as his mentor was gone, he just kind of went wicked. And as a result of that, Jehoiada's son, so this would have been Joash's sort of like, almost like adoptive brother, confronted him about it, and he had that guy killed. He had Jehoiada's son killed, the one that had raised him. He had his son killed. So Joash kind of ended wicked, even though he started out good. Once his mentor was gone, it was just like a downhill slide for him. So we're going to skip Amaziah and talk about Uzziah next. Uzziah was another great king of Israel. He was a hunter. He was like a gardener. He was a great military leader. They kind of made their land bigger during that time. They won a lot of military victories. It was a great time for Israel. And he worshiped the Lord, and he got rid of Asherah poles and Baal poles. And this was just a great time. And During his reign, Isaiah starts. So when you read the very beginning of Isaiah, it's talking about when Uzziah was king and these great times in Israel. And then Isaiah goes all the way into next month. You can kind of see if you look on the chart, he starts with Uzziah and prophesies all the way through to Hezekiah. So Uzziah, he's this great king. However, because he was such a great king and he was God's chosen one, he thought that he should be able to offer sacrifices in the temple. So remember, just the priests were supposed to go in. The kings didn't have a right to do that, only the Levite priest. Well, he goes in and offers a sacrifice in the temple, and when he does that, he is stricken with leprosy, and he quickly gets out of the temple, and he lives out the rest of his life with leprosy, because even though he was a good king and he worshiped the Lord, when he disobeyed the Lord and thought that he could make choices that only God was authorized to make, he ended up while he was a great king and they had great times, he made this one mistake and it kind of burned him through the rest of his life. At the end of this month, it just started on Hezekiah, but we'll talk about Hezekiah next month. He's another good king. During this time, though, in Judah, we have a couple prophets that prophesied. So on the chart, I have Obadiah and Joel here. First of all, we really don't know when Obadiah and Joel were written. And so if you're reading different chronological plans, sometimes it has it about here, and sometimes it has it way at the end of the Old Testament, because those are just impossible to date. So Obadiah is mostly, though, his whole prophecy is to Edom. So Edom, the Edomites, they're from Esau. Remember Esau? Way back in Genesis? They come from him, and God is basically saying, Israel and Judah, your brothers, when they're defeated, you're enjoying it. You're like laughing at them and delighting in their defeat, and so you're going to be defeated too. So it's just about the judgment of Edom that is coming. And that's Obadiah. And Joel, he is talking about a famine that's coming, and the locusts are going to come with this famine. He's also talking about the day of the Lord. And so some of it is talking about like end times prophecy, and some of it's talking about when they're going to restore the people back to, once they go into captivity, bringing them back to Jerusalem. And so your basic prophecies in there about, serve the Lord or he's going to bring judgment. But even after he brings judgment, in the end, he will restore you and redeem you. All of these stories are covered in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And then in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you have the same stories, but mostly it just covers the kings of Judah. It says very little about the kings of Israel. So Chronicles is about the kings of Judah, and Kings is about the kings of Judah and Israel. So a lot of the stories are covered in both. Chronicles was written actually way, way later, at the very end of the Old Testament. It is someone recapping all of the history of Israel. And so that's why we see Chronicles kind of broken up, bits of it here and bits of it there, through the whole Old Testament, because this chronological plan put each story where that event occurred chronologically, even though it was written way later as kind of a recap, almost to the whole Old Testament, what Deuteronomy is to the time of Moses. You know how Deuteronomy, it's more of like a recap of everything that had happened in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Numbers. One thing that makes all of the prophets pretty difficult is that sometimes they're talking about the judgment that is coming when Assyrians were going to take away Israel. And sometimes they're talking about the judgment that's going to come when Babylon was going to defeat Judah. Sometimes they're talking about the way future judgment of God that, end time stuff. And also when they're talking about God redeeming the people and restoring them and bringing them back, sometimes they're talking about the end of the Old Testament, which we will get to. People are brought back to Jerusalem. And sometimes it's talking about end times. And then also there's quite a bit of stuff about Jesus in there, talking about that time. And so a lot of times it changes back and forth very quickly, and sometimes there's even double meanings, especially in Isaiah. Sometimes he's talking about him, like Isaiah the servant, and he's also talking about Jesus. And so there's these double meanings where it's talking about now and later, or later and way, way later. And so as when we're reading through the whole Bible in a year, if you take time to figure out what every single verse is talking about in terms of like end times, Jesus times, end of the Old Testament times, right now where they were times, that would take, I can't even imagine what it would take to try to decipher all of that. And so just try to read through it, and if you're not really sure what it pertains to, just kind of keep reading. Okay, we have one more book to cover this month, and that is the book of Hosea. Hosea lived in Israel, but he prophesied to both Israel and Judah during the time that he lived. You gotta know that I love Hosea. I don't know how many of you guys have read the book Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. I don't usually love biblical fiction, but this is a biblical fiction one. It's loosely based on the book of Hosea. If you have time to read, I know that you guys have taken on a huge reading project this year, reading the entire Bible in a year, but if you have time for some extra reading or maybe even following up after you read through the Bible, the book Redeeming Love by Francine River is really fantastic. So, Hosea, he's this prophet, and God tells him, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go marry a prostitute. And so you have a fantastic reputation, and she has a horrible reputation, and I want you to give your reputation and your name to her. Stake your reputation on her and your name on her. Even though God knew it was not going to be a good bet. And so Hosea gave everything to her. He married her, he pursued her and married her and gave her his name and gave her everything he had. And after a while, she went out and became a prostitute again and gave herself to other lovers. And God told him to go pay for her again and win her back and marry her, bring her back into his home. So why did God do this? It's kind of a weird story, right? To tell Hosea to go through this. But this God who desires to be known. Remember, all along, I've said that God, one of his great desires is to be known. All through the Bible, he is showing us who he is. He's saying, look at what I've done. Look at my story. Look at what I've made. Look at creation. And see who I am. He does great miracles throughout the Bible. We see these huge miracles. And his miracles are an attempt to be known. He's showing the humans who he is. He's saying, know me, see me, look at what I can do, look at who I am. But most of these things, they're telling us what God is like in terms of like kind of the exterior world, like what he can do, what he has done. And in Hosea, we see a different side of God. Because in this, he's not just showing us what he can do, and we're getting to know him through that. He's showing us sort of like his insides. Like all along, I've been asking, what is God's experience in this story? The story of humankind, the story of the Bible. And in Hosea, God says, you want to know what my experience has been with Israel and with the human race. So I'm going to paint a picture for you because I want you to understand not just what I can do, but I want you to understand my experience, my story, what I've been through on the inside. He's vulnerable in this book because he's God Almighty, and he could just kind of like, oh, you don't want me? I'll choose another. He could kind of be like above it, right? He doesn't have to be hurt by this. He doesn't have to be the rejected one. He could be, he's the great one. And you know, like when someone breaks up with you or with a friend, when people say like, oh, you know, her loss or his loss, and they weren't good enough for you anyway. And you kind of like explain it away or say, oh yeah, it was mutual that we broke up. Because you want to preserve a little bit of your dignity, right? And not say that that person was too good for you. Like that would be the worst, right? God, in his vulnerability in this story of Hosea, he says, you want to know what my experience has been like? You want to know what's happened inside, what it's felt like to go through this story? Okay, I'll tell you. This is what it has felt like. It felt like I married her. It felt like she was a prostitute and I was God. And I married her. And I gave her my name. I took my reputation and my name, and I gave it to her. And I gave her gifts. I lavished gifts on her. You want to know what it felt like for me to go through that story? It felt like she took my name and she dragged it through the mud. It felt like she took the gifts that I gave her and she used it to pay for other lovers. It felt like she was my wife and she prostituted herself to other lovers and she gave the gifts that I gave her to them. It's like I bought her a bracelet for her anniversary. And she took the bracelet and put it on the wrist of her lover. That's what it's felt like for me. There's a verse that says that Israel's sins are before they're in God's face. God says, you know what it's felt like for me to go through this story? It feels like my wife is with other lovers and I have to watch it. Every moment of it, every sound, everything that can be seen, I'm there. And it's in front of my face. I have to watch her cheat on me. And after watching her cheat on me and giving her my name and seeing her drag my name through the mud, and after she took the gifts that I gave her and gave them to her other lovers, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take her back. I'm going to buy her back. I'm going to win her back. I'm going to speak tenderly to her. I'm going to allure her. I'm going to bring her back. God says, how can I give you up? How can I surrender you? My heart is turned over within me, and all of my compassions are kindled. How does God respond, like in his inside, to the betrayal, to the abandonment? All of his compassions are kindled. This God who wants to be known, in this book of Hosea, he shows us what his experience has been like.